I'd like to continue talking about Mississippian by talking about Cahokia. Cahokia was the largest civic ceremonial mound center in North America. It was located in the American Bottom, a 20-mile wide stretch of floodplain in the central Mississippi River Valley, just outside of present-day St. Louis. I've previously talked about the Southeastern ceremonial complex, and I previously talked about what is a chiefdom. Today, I will summarize the developments that led from the late Woodland egalitarian societies in the area of the American Bottom to the hierarchical Mississippian societies. Archaeologists divide the time periods into three sections: late Woodland, Emergent Mississippian, and Mississippian. Emergent Mississippian is a term not always used today, but I find it very useful. Late Woodland is characterized by separate, more or less equivalent socio-political groups who are egalitarian. During the Emergent Mississippian, political centralization began in the American Bottom. Throughout late Woodland and Emergent Mississippian, we see population increase, which culminates in Mississippian establishment of Cahokia as a paramount mound civic ceremonial center for the area. Late Woodland in the American Bottom is subdivided into three phases, each 150 to 200 years in length. Initially, we see scattered households with individual storage. They're farming the starchy seed complex, they are hunting, and they're gathering wild nuts. We find very little variety in pottery vessels at the beginning of the late Woodland period. However, by the end of the late Woodland period, houses are arranged around a central plaza. We find deep storage pits and a greater variety of vessel shapes. Oily seeds are added to the starchy seed complex, and maize begins to supplement the diet in a minor way. We also see more use of tobacco and of pipes. The next period in the American Bottom is unique to this area, and as I said, not a period that is always used now, the Emergent Mississippian. During this period, the maize and Eastern agricultural complex rose in importance, and collecting wild nuts fell. We see a move to centralized power at a regional center, and evidence for the rise of an elite class. Along with this, the social context of eating became more complex, as evidenced by increasing variety in vessel forms. The Emergent Mississippian period in the American Bottom stretched from AD 800 to 1000. Initially, in the bottoms, we find villages with central plazas, and in the uplands, we find scattered houses. Farming, the Eastern agricultural complex, rises in importance, as does maize. And by the end, people may have begun to build at Cahokia. And near Cahokia, we find small linear settlements on low floodplain ridges. Further away, we still find villages with central plazas. We find both individual and now also evidence for communal storage. We see more intense farming of the Eastern agricultural complex and a rise in the importance in maize in the diet, and a lot less emphasis on wild nuts, and a greater elaboration in pottery vessels. Mississippian begins with the Loman phase, AD 1000 to 1050. Although we find the same basic food, the social settings in which food is consumed change drastically, as evidenced by new variation in vessels and more slipping of various colors. The community layout changed as the entire valley fell under the influence of Cahokia. Nucleated villages disappear. People live either in the mound town or they live on scattered farms or hamlets. Mound centers grow in size and influence. We find not only multiple mound towns like Cahokia, we find some single mound towns. During this earliest phase, Cahokia began building mounds on planned solar alignments, and elaborate burials indicate growing elite power. This map shows some of the astronomical alignments made by Mounds. In particular, I point out here Mound 72 and the ways in which these alignments crossed. Here's a sketch illustrating when the summer solstice sunset could be marked, the sunrise, the winter solstice sunset, the summer solstice sunrise, and the winter solstice sunrise, and also equinox, all marked by the location of various features and mounds. Mound 72 was a ridge-top mound, and it was built over the burial of an elite male. Nearby, 3 males and 1 female elite were also buried. The elite male burial was laid on a cloak of shell beads. Note how the beads were laid out in the shape of a verd, very similar to the shape of a rock mound in central Georgia. Buried with the primary elite male burial were 4 headless, handless men. Over 50 young women apparently were sacrificed to accompany this burial. We find also other individuals buried on litters or with caches of copper, mica, and arrowheads. During the next phase, the Sterling phase, we find the peak of Cahokia. Monk's Mound, which was 10 acres in size at the base, was completed. Many more mounds were built, and the central mound precinct was enclosed in a palisade. During the Sterling phase, Cahokia influence spread very wide. Some remote nodal communities served as religious centers for outlying people, and these nodal communities have mortuary complexes. Now we find 3 levels of mound towns. Cahokia itself, with over 120 mounds. We find also 4 smaller mound groups, and then we find single mound towns, rural nodes, and scattered farmsteads. This is an artist's reconstruction of what Cahokia looked like during the Sterling phase. People were growing the same crops, but we find changes in how food is stored and how food is consumed. Away from Cahokia, in the bottoms, isolated households put their deep storage pits inside their houses for the first time. Perhaps this reflects polarization of power. Rural people lost their autonomy to the mound centers, but an individual household could reassume control over their own economy by hiding their storage pits and the food within them. It may also have been a way of hiding the true amount of food stored to lessen their required tribute to the mound town. Vessels became more elaborate. We see more shapes and more colors, and we find now mostly tempering with shell, one hallmark of Mississippian. Here, for example, we also find the first Powell Plain vessels. We find a new type of black burnished ritual ware called Ramey incised. This has incised designs around the rim with a lot of symbolic meaning behind these designs and their arrangements, their symmetrical arrangements. Ramey incised pots are highly symbolic, and they appear to provide links between elites at the main mound center versus the nodal centers or the sites further away. Other typical artifacts from the Cahokia chiefdom include Cahokia points, which are small triangular points that are serrated and sometimes notched, but quite distinctive. We commonly find Mill Creek hoes. Mill Creek refers to the type of chert that was quarried in southern Illinois. How do we know these were hoes? Well, on the working edges, we find a silica sheen. Plants take up silica during their lifetime, and after their death, the little silica or stone skeletons fall into the ground. And then if you were to hoe that dirt, it polishes the rock. We find wall trench house construction, another marker that often indicates Mississippian. In this, instead of digging individual holes for each upright wooden post, you dig a trench. You set your posts in there and then set in horizontal locking logs, a much faster way of building walls. During the next phase, the Moorhead phase, 1150 to 1250, population falls in the American Bottom, and people begin to move elsewhere. We suppose this might be due to environmental problems, such as the availability of wild deer and the availability of wood. It's been pointed out that to build the palisade around Cahokia, which was rebuilt several times, each time getting bigger or having bastions, to burn all the wood to build the houses required a lot of wood. And we see a progression through time of people using the bottomland woods, then having to go perhaps 20 miles to the uplands to fetch wood. And then we start to see again early phases of wood coming back into the bottomlands as population begins to fall. People continued to build mounds, and Cahokia was still in use. During the Sand Prairie phase, AD 1250 to 1400, we see continued depopulation of Cahokia. People are moving out of town, and we see a restructuring of society, although some mounds at Cahokia continued to be used. The residential area shifted to west of Monk's Mound, where there used to be large public structures. One of the central mounds had a few non-elite burials, indicating a shift in the function of the mound. American Bottom depopulation continued. We find greater local group autonomy. So mound towns that had been subordinate under Cahokia continued to function on their own authority. And little archaeological work has been done on the 1400s. So to sum up, during the Emergent Mississippian AD 800 to 1000, we see a settlement pattern characterized by small nucleated communities, either aligned along bottomland ridges or around a central plaza. We find isolated farmsteads in both the floodplain and in the uplands. Occasionally, structures were repaired or superimposed, showing some depth of time to a settlement. Most houses were semi-subterranean, rectangular, and small, and pits occurred near the house. Beginning the Mississippian AD 1000, we see a big change to low-density occupation outside of the mound towns. So inside the mound towns, of course, you have a lot of people living, but outside you find mostly dispersed farmsteads with just one or more structures and their associated pits. And most of the farmsteads are in the bottomland or close by in the uplands. We find a new construction technique using wall trench instead of single post construction. Houses initially were rectangular, but they became square and larger and built with a slight basin. Occasionally, farmstead structures were repaired or superimposed. Pits occur near houses, and some have sweat lodges. Mounds are most common in the early Mississippian Loman and Sterling phases, that is, AD 1000 to 1100. But their use continued into later Mississippian. Some mound towns are multi-mound, the largest of which was Cahokia, but some of them had a single mound. All of mound towns had different start and end dates of use. We find exotic, that is, non-local materials, such as distinctive pottery and various raw materials coming into this area. During the late Woodland Patrick phase, we find small quantities of hematite, galena, and bauxite, all types of stone. During the Emergent Mississippian, we find limited amounts of the Mill Creek chert. We find copper, hematite, galena, and bauxite, and also a few vessels from further south in Illinois and Indiana and along the Mississippi River. But during the Mississippian, we find pottery vessels from distant sources. They're found not only at mound centers, but also at smaller sites. We find copper, mica, whelk shells, various cherts, galena, hematite, and bauxite. And the exotic goods especially are found associated with elite burials. The more we learn about the sequence in one place, like we have at Cahokia, the more complex the picture becomes. Mississippian flourished early in the American Bottom area, the Middle Mississippi Valley. Archaeologists have proposed two models for the spread of Mississippian from this area outward across the Southeast. One is that it spread from a single source of ideas, like Cahokia, where the ideology and the people migrated outward. A second model is that simultaneous development occurred, that is, independent invention, facilitated, of course, by interaction. We think that both of these models applied, that in some places people literally moved, taking the idea of Mississippian with them, and in other places people developed it themselves by interacting with these other people